Hello there, and welcome to an XG2 speedrunning guide. This is going to be split into three sections. The first one is going to be menus, modes, how they affect the game, and bike selection. The second one is going to be about turning, shooting, and also general gameplay stuff. The third section is going to be a bunch of miscellaneous information that might be useful in about a handful of situations. There will also be a text guide made by Mr. Blonde linked in the description in case there are some things that I do not cover or simply don't know much about and can't cover in video form. With that out of the way, let's go ahead and get started. Okay, first things first, we are going to be covering the extreme contests and how the AI changes dependent on which one you choose, and also how many races are in each extreme contest. The first one we'll start off with is Atomic. Atomic is the slowest in terms of AI. They are not as fierce, and there are 4 races total. Next up, we have Critical Mass, which is 8 races total, and the AI is a little more fierce than Atomic. Next up, we have Meltdown, which is 12 races in total, and the bike's AI will now be at full speed and are a bit of a threat compared to all the others. Next up, we have Duel, which is a one-on-one and still has 12 races like Meltdown, and the bikes you're racing are actually the ones that you can select before starting a race. Example being Wasp or Spectre. And last but not least, in my opinion the hardest, we have Mirror Mode. This is also 12 races, and you cannot fail once. You have to come in first place every time. And the tracks are all reversed. Next, we are going to go over the single-player modes. The first one should be dead obvious, is Time Trials. It's where the most convenient place is to do fastest lap attempts. The next single-player mode we have is Arcade Mode. Now, this one doesn't really have a category for it, but what you do is you shoot a bunch of drones that come out with your bike because it has a weapon built in and it has unlimited ammo in it. You do it until your shields run out. It's actually a pretty good place to practice like shooting at an angle or just getting your shots just right, which is actually really important for a lot of categories except for Pacifist, because with Pacifist you'll have to have weapons disabled in the options menu. We will get to Pacifist category in a minute. Okay, and lastly we have Practice Mode here, which is basically just if you were to play the game as normal, but you can select whatever track you want and whatever difficulty that you have unlocked. The other thing to note is that Practice Mode is used for full track, and weapons are disabled for full track, so you don't just murder everything in your path and get a really fast time, because you have to go around each 3 laps. It's also a really good place to practice any track that you feel like you're really, really weak at when it comes to reacting to AI in specific spots or whatnot. Okay, so this is the next one we're going to go over is the options menu. The options menu is where you can enter passwords, you know, all that stuff for unlocking stuff. Sound effects volume, speech volume, music volume, change what music you want to listen to from the game. Now you can change what you have over the bikes, whether it be names or positions. You can change weapons on and off. You can also change how many laps you want. Gonna note the important features here. Obviously weapons on and off for specific categories. But there's also the fact that display positions are actually really useful, because if you want it to be a number because you can't see the names that well, you can change that. If it's vice versa, you can also change that. Okay, so now to go over track variants. Now, track variants are basically a difference in the tracks based on difficulty that are also selectable when selecting time trials or practice. For example, Aquanor. Stage 1 would be the harbor, Stage 2 would be Submarine Bay, and Stage 3 would be Cliff Tops. So basically, in the order in which they are played difficulty-wise, is how we number them from stage 1, 2, and 3. You also have the mirror version of the tracks, but those aren't on the individual level leaderboards, at the current moment at least. Now to move on to superbikes and their differences. Venom is probably the slowest out of them from what we understand, but the speed acceleration when you break the sound barrier with Venom is really, really high. So that in itself can be really, really broken at times and make it a good choice for some tracks. Then we have Wasp, which he is okay, I guess. I mean, he's well-rounded. I've used him a few times. We don't see him too often. That's because we have Spectre, which is the fastest out of them all in terms of base acceleration, but he's the hardest to control and will take quite a bit of getting used to. So now we move on to the next menu that's accessible through the bike selection screen, as it prompted on the bottom there to press a specific button. This is where you can change the controls in-game, but you can also do that on the emulator, so it makes it kind of void. But there's one feature here that matters, which is the enter name feature. If you want to have your time trials recorded in your name specifically, or when you're doing a full game run, you want it to be your name, this is it right here. It only allows for all capitals, but hey, it works. Now to move on to how categories would be played. Now, this is only going to matter for, I would say, the difference between pacifist and every other category, for the most part, but it's still worth mentioning. So, if you were doing anything that's not pacifist related, this is an example right here. I don't have the best gameplay of this because I mainly run pacifist category. I will link Mr. Blonde's gameplay in the description. But basically, for an atomic run, or a meltdown run, or a critical mass run, or duel, you would be trying to shoot the opponents like this and kill them as fast as possible. There's also a weird oddity sometimes. We don't know why this happens, where sometimes your shot will do twice as much damage, and I don't really know how to explain that too well, or why it happens for that matter, but it's a thing. That's basically how it will go. We call that genocide, basically. We just call it genocide route, or race, or whatever the hell you want to call it. So when it comes to full game categories, Spectre is usually the best overall in most cases, although there is a degree of preference, at least I would say in pacifist category there is. Some people might prefer using Venom over Spectre, especially if you're still just getting started, because Spectre is a handful and a half to control in any way. Okay, now it's time to go over how to skip the starting animation of races. The starting animation is basically a roundabout animation that will show you each of the bikes, and then it will start the countdown. But you can skip the animation by just pressing the A button and then the Z button to whatever you have it binded to. So, for example, on my controller here, which is an Xbox One controller, I have A and Z binded to A and X. So I pressed A and X together to skip the animation. This is vital to pretty much everything, because if you have to wait through each animation, it just wastes time entirely. Okay, so we're going to be covering turns now, and one thing to mention about turns is for this lap you're going to see mostly sharp turns, like right about, let's say, here. Right there. You notice how we kind of went a little too far? Like we kind of turned really, really, really hard, like kind of fast. Those are called sharp turns. For a course like this, you don't really use sharp turns too often because a lot of them are really shallow turns that you'll need to make instead of like something you'll need to immediately just take a turn for. But sharp turns are just performed by just pulling down while going left or right at the same time. So like a diagonal left or a diagonal right. That's how you perform sharp turns. Again, they're better for turns that are not longer like these, which is why we'll get into the moment this lap finishes. Bam. We'll get into regular turns and soft turns. Regular turns is just going to the left or the right. Not much else. It's good for most turns. And then there's soft turns. You're seeing a little bit of this right there, especially because that's like a very slight angle. There's no real way to actually explain this to someone past a certain point because they kind of have to get a feel for it. But soft turns are better for longer corners and can also maintain your speed quite a bit if you're just trying to make a really, really shallow turn and there's nothing in your path that can stop you. It's really complicated to kind of fully sit down and explain, and it's going to be the same thing with when we get to braking and sliding, and that's because of the fact that the feel for this game is real fucking weird. Any little mistake, like you just saw there, drops you off into the side of the course, or you'll hit a wall, and hitting a wall in this game is detrimental to your speed entirely. Unlike the first Extreme G game, it is very detrimental and you will lose speed almost instantly. Next up, we're going to be covering sliding and braking. What you are going to be seeing here is how sliding and also slide tapping works. I'm going to note that there is not really a good way to explain how to slide very well, because it's one of those things that you're just going to have to learn and experiment with, but it will possibly shoot you in the wrong direction if you're going really, really fast, like above 500 or even 700, or in the middle of a nitrous especially. But that doesn't mean it's impossible to not use it. It's just you have to get a feel for it. There's too much to explain in regards to sliding. But regardless, here's an example of slide turning or slide tapping. And right there is some slide turning and or slide tapping. As you can see, I'm pressing RT on the controller to slide, which I have it mapped to the equivalent of the R button on the Nintendo 64 controller. So if you were using a Nintendo 64 controller on the emulator, you'd probably be tapping R. If you were going to use a regular brake, which we barely ever use, which we will cover next, you'd be pressing L. But that's some examples of slide turning. Hopefully it helps, but it is hard to explain. I will also give an example of what it looks like if it's done completely wrong, right in about a few seconds here. It's not pretty. Yeah, just don't hold down the slide turn button. Okay, so here are some examples of using the brake by itself. As you can see, it is not very effective, and slide turning is just strictly better pretty much 99% of the time. I have it mapped to LT, which is the equivalent of L on the Nintendo 64 controller on default controls. We don't use the brake by itself very often because of this reason. Too much slowdown, wastes too much speed, and just overall kills your momentum. Anyways, I will mention here soon with some footage that we do actually combine these two brakes together at times for some very important tracks and also to turn around during time trials. As obviously seen here, this is a turnaround. You press both of the brakes and you turn. The reason this works is because one brake is the slide turn, which lets you slide. The other one brings you to a halt, which allows you to turn around when turning, which is kind of useful right about there if you are able to correctly maneuver it onto the ramp and go over. It's useful on the track Asheton, which you're seeing now, in order to just save a lot of time, because there's a roundabout on the track that you'd normally have to go all the way around, but you just do that instead. We'll go over the ramping part too, because that's not as simple as just go over the ramp. There is some pulling up and down to be covered, and how much distance and how much height you'll gain off of pulling up and or down or staying neutral. So to clarify, when I mean pulling up, down, or neutral, it means what direction the bike will go. As you can see right there, that means it's going down. So you pull forward on the control stick, it pulls the bike down. If you pull back on the control stick, it pulls the bike up. Obviously that would make sense. So the thing is about ramps and how they are affected by speed is that you can tell that we made it over by pulling up. Now we're going to do it neutral, and we didn't make it. The reason for this is that when you pull up, you gain quite a lot of height just instantaneously when going off of a ramp, which is really, really useful for making gaps. You don't have to go as far as you saw there, especially because you saw me earlier just go right over the ramp entirely. I pulled back on the control stick and or up to make it over. Okay, so now to show an example of vertical dropping and or V-dropping. As you can see, we pulled back and then forward on the control stick the moment that we decided to go down the hill. We went really fast there. We gained a fuck ton of speed when going down the hill. To clarify, since I actually said that wrong, you would want to sometimes pull back earlier, and other times you'd want to pull back a little later and then pull forward. The timing for each different individual ramp is a lot different, so again, that's a matter of experience. For example here, this is an absolute fail at a V-drop. As weird as that sounds, you can do V-drops on literally anything that's a ramp, including if it's a flat surface. There you go. That's a semi-successful V-drop. It wasn't the best, but it gained me some speed there. That's one of the harder things to learn to do, is the V-dropping. Not on the longer slopes, but more or less the really short slopes, especially if it's trying to go from an uphill onto a straight. Okay, so now it's time to move on to one of the bigger elephants in the room, and that is nitrous. Depending on what you are doing, if it is time trials or actual game runs, nitrous is something that you'll need to know when to use and when not to use. There's also nitrous pads, but I'll explain a bit about one of the anomalies in that in a minute. Typically, if you are doing an extreme contest, you would want to use 1 nitrous per lap, just because of the fact that that alone is probably your fastest bet on most tracks. There is an exception to that rule. One example would be Aquanor Submarine Bay, as in, that's the second stage of Aquanor. You would basically use a nitro at the end of the first lap to get a better second lap start, but there's not very many courses where you would use more than 3 nitros. So typically, you just want to use 3 nitroses. For time trials, it depends on knowing which spots to use and how to maintain the speed. While in nitrous, it's very hard to maintain anything. But right here, right about, bam, right there. Do you notice how we went over the nitrous pad? Not like literally over, but we went over it, but it didn't register. That's one thing to keep an eye out for and try to get a feel for in this game, is that there is a weird jank with the nitrous pads where sometimes they will not register and give you nitrous oxide if you either A, hit them at a weird angle, or B, you go too fast, and sometimes it just doesn't work. The other thing to mention about nitrous is when you are in this state, especially past the, would say 780 to 800, your camera will shift out and it will be a lot harder to control. It'll become a lot more twitchy. So slight stick movements are very important. Make sure to be more with the slight stick movements instead of like trying to jank turns or whatnot, especially if you're trying to maintain a sound barrier break after a nitro on courses that aren't straight like this one here. Okay, so we've made it to the miscellaneous section. I'm just gonna kind of spitball a little bit here instead of like structuring it, but basically one of the other key things is setting your counter factor, as seen here in your emulator settings, to 1. The reason for setting it to 1 is that it decreases load times by a ton. Another thing to mention about the PC version is that it's an absolute wild card, because it has this slider here called game speed, which speeds up the game. PC version is still valid for individual level and full track, but not for anything that's a full game category because of load time differences, and we also still do not have a category separation for it, and we might never have one. But again, that remains to be seen. We don't really know for certain. I'm also going to cover a few other things, like the arrow that you usually see on the left side of your screen. That's not always on the left side. Depending on which version of the game you're playing, you will see that arrow that tells you, hey, go this way when turning. If you are playing the Japanese version, it's actually in the middle instead of on the left. To be honest, I don't really have much else I can explain or say here without just talking on and on, so feel free to ask questions in the comments if there's anything that you need to know, or also for anyone that knows what the fuck they're talking about, if there's anything you think that I've missed entirely, feel free to point it out, and I'll try to either make a follow-up or I will slap myself 100 times with Spectre.